in your jazz career, there came a point when it seemed that you were becoming a lot more influenced by like Louis Armstrong and earlier jazz. Can you talk a little bit about that and what was going on in your head that caused that shift?
Well, you know, I was always ignorant of the history and tradition. And just being like my generation, influenced by writers, you know, and all this kind of reading stuff for people who don't know about the music, trying to take you away from the identity of it, not in the past or the future, because a lot of the elements of what they were writing had more to do with whether something had a black type of vibe to it or not. So I knew I could see underneath it, but when you don't know nothing, just because you can see something don't mean you can do anything about it. And my daddy had taught the history of jazz, and he was always telling me, man, you need to listen to Pops, you need to listen to Pops. But you know, we didn't like Pops in my generation, man. We had our afros, and you know, Malcolm X, Martin. Then you got a dude from the minstrel era. It didn't go down. So I never listened to Pops. But then when I was 18, my daddy sent me a cassette tape of Pops. Then we had cassettes. I had a boom box, you know, it was one thing I had when I left home. He said, man, listen to, learn one of these Pop solos. You know, I was used to trying to learn Freddie Hubbard solos, like on the Trumpet Fox and stuff like that. Some Pops, I'm thinking, man, you know, Pop whole time. So I put the solo on to Jubilee. Man, I could not play that solo. I said, damn, how am I gonna let some old timey music like that? I can't play it. So then, I worked on it. And I realized just how much endurance Pops had. And I understood what the things Pops was doing that I had no chance of doing. The weight of Pops' sound, the expressiveness of his sound, the way he played with rhythm, the diversity of the rhythms, the kind of logic that he played with, the brilliance he played, the high notes, all the things I was observing. I said, I wonder why we stop playing like with this kind of vibe. So, you know, I start to think, because you got to remember, for me, my generation, we were playing funk anyway. So I wasn't looking at the distance between me and Miles was just as great as the distance between me and Pops. People weren't playing that way. So then I started listening to Pops and learning like the hot 5 and the hot 7. So I figured from the time I was like 18, 19, 20, 21, I still wasn't playing that kind of music, but I was listening to it and trying to learn it. Then I was playing old wild music we were playing, you know, kind of chromatic, everybody saying, oh, they sound like Miles Band from the 60s. We were trying to play like Miles Band from the 60s, Trains Band, Mingus. But I was still listening to Pops, and because I knew Sweet Edison and I loved him, he was always talking about Basie in the 1930s. I didn't listen to music from that time period. And I started to figure, what would it take for me to be sophisticated enough to actually know about the music? And at that point, I met Al Murray, and he would always tease me. And he would always say, well, you got the integrity to stand up to everything that's going on, but you don't know nothing. So if it came down to you representing the music, you don't even know whole periods of the music. You can't even identify it. And I couldn't argue with him. He was right. So all through my 20s, even now, I mean, I still always trying to increase my knowledge and understanding. But I think that's what started me on the path of not embracing ignorance as a way forward. And it's still most people in the kind of jazz environment, because it's dominated by kind of critics that want to push it in the direction of European art music. Most people still embrace like that kind of viewpoint of the music, like it has to imitate the trajectory of European classical music. But it doesn't have to do that, because it has a heavy traditional element in it that comes from African consciousness and music, and a spiritual element that doesn't have anything to do with how abstract you can play. Because the abstraction is also in how you come together with other people. The abstraction is also in your sound, and the abstraction is also in the choices you make when you improvise. Now, the abstraction is in the interlocking of parts. So, you know, when I start to realize how holistic the philosophy was of jazz, but also how difficult it would be to understand it if you did not have a kind of a type of non-Western philosophical base with a Western base. Like, you couldn't discard the Western base, but you had to add to it the non-Western. And most times when people understand the depth of non-Western thinking, they want to discard Western thinking. You can't play jazz if you discard that. So you have to keep both of them. And because I was from New Orleans and we have such an African presence and we're so proud of it, you know, I was able to construct a much stronger philosophical base. It, of course, did not sway all the people who were writing and talking about the music. There's no way for them to know that. It's just too much information. But I understood that then I needed to not run from the ancestors, but embrace them. And that their strength was not a weakness of mine. And that their strength could be used as a platform to build. And I also saw my father in that way. So it helped me. I didn't have to go through the thing of, in Western mythology, it's a whole thing of Saturn eating his children and the father wanting to kill the kids and the kid having to overcome the father. That's not a prevalent thing in African philosophical belief. So I never had that toward my father, you know. I always had like a kind of veneration and a respect. And he was always the one who was saying, play in the funk band, do this or do that. He was not a person who believed it, and you got to recreate the past. He was too much of a jazz musician. He knew you couldn't do it. But he also was philosophical enough to understand when I started to explain to him what we needed to do in a certain generation to build that bridge. Now, the musicians still don't want to walk over that bridge. And I understand that because it's very hard to leave the plantation. You know, it's difficult. So I'm not mad at anybody because they want to stay on the plantation. But I just want to make sure that the bridge is there because there's welcome for all of the musicians. It's like what Coltrane said in that Black Nationalist book. Made me laugh all the years ago. This music is for everybody. You know, and now that the DNA is telling us everybody is African, you don't have to be divorced from Africa. It's not necessary for you to denigrate them or to, it's a big place with a lot of different people. And it's the fault of a lot of creativity. And it's not a thing that had to be at odds with the West, though the West was at odds with it. We don't have to have that type of posture. And I don't have it, and I did not have it. So it enabled me to learn a lot more about music and bring another perspective with a lot of confidence. Now, a lot of that perspective has been avoided because who's going to talk about it? It's not possible for the critical establishment we have. They're not equipped to talk about that kind of thing because that's not what they're interested in. You know, they're interested in the kind of, they're interested in making sure that the Beatles remain the top band in American music. And as long as they can do that, everything falls in underneath that. That was never my objective, to fall in underneath that worldview. So it still creates problems in that paradigm. But now with the younger people who are coming up, they know so little about any kind of music that whatever that was is no longer important. But it's not their fault because now it's another whole thing that they're listening to. They're listening to very creative products made many times by non-musicians who, because they're not musicians, they actually can create a product that's stronger than a musician with no integrity. So I always tell my younger students, don't think a non-musician is bad because they create musical kind of art products that require more charisma and taste, and they come up with a lot of creative things that a musician would not come up with because that musician is limited by the knowledge of music. You know, as a musician, you know what I mean. It's things
I know
you're
exactly
not
what you mean.
Consider because you're a musician. But a non-musician would be like, okay, I don't know the harmony. This sounds good together. And it'll be something that you'll be like, damn, what is that?
It's as if you can create a cage. The rules create a cage of your own making.
Well, yeah, the knowledge is a cage, even if you have open-minded. Because your knowledge base, whatever it is, keeps you from perceiving as someone who has no knowledge. And someone with no knowledge is going to figure out something that a person with knowledge will not figure out. Now, it does not mean ultimately you would rather hear a person with no knowledge, but it means there will be something that a person without knowledge can come up with. And people with knowledge sometimes make the mistake of only listening to the most ignorant parts of a person with no knowledge, but you have to listen to the creative parts of a person with no knowledge of things too, because they come up with stuff.